Hello and welcome to FinextraTV's film review of Our Planet, Too Big to Fail, a film inspired by the award-winning 8-part natural history Netflix series, which illustrates the crucial role the finance sector can play in accelerating a sustainable future. Joining me to evaluate this eye-opening picture and guide us through its purpose, solution, the evidence it presents and the action it calls for is, of course, Richard Pears from Responsible Risk. So welcome, Richard. Thank you very much for joining me on this review.
Well, I wouldn't be anywhere else. Nice to see you again, Hannah.
It's nice to see you. So yes, this is a real privilege to take a look at this film because the series has been captivating right from the beginning, and I've personally learnt a lot. And then for this film to come along and sort of continue that narrative that we've been working with our sustainable finance community to project is something really special for us. It's also arrived at a particularly poignant time as we witness another global shock since the 2008 financial crash, which is, of course, the current pandemic, isn't it? So this really hammers home one of the many lessons from the film that we can't ignore, the signs from science when they flash red. Anyway, enough from me. I'll let you jump in. What were your first impressions of the film?
Well, I mean, I think the first impression is that, you know, it is obviously a beautiful film. And as you would expect, it's got all of that quality, you know, from people that have produced some of the greatest natural history films that we've ever seen. And of course, with, you know, David Attenborough involved in it, you know, it's got the blessing of the great within it. So it has all of that beauty and gravitas. But the real striking thing is that it's absolutely not trying to sort of sugarcoat the message and just drop in at the end that, you know, oh, we ought to just hang on and protect this a bit. It starts from the beginning with an absolute, you know, emphasis on, you know, this isn't just about saving a few animals, folks. You know, if that's what you were thinking, this is about saving humanity.
That's right. It starts with a real powerful beginning, doesn't it? Talking about the threat from climate change and how biodiversity loss has now become exponential. And then from here, we learn about the tie with economics, the numbers of which are telling us climate change is happening in our lifetime, and that we've only got this 10-year window to make the necessary changes needed before we reach a place of no return. And this is because of what? We've got overfishing, extensive agriculture, deforestation, burning of greenhouse gases. The list goes on, but it'd be great if you could highlight the problem in more detail, maybe give us a recap from the lessons learned through the SF.Live events and what this could lead to.
Well, I think the thing that that it strikes you with is that and I've obviously seen this around before, but they do a really beautiful job of talking about the biomes, which are these, you know, great combinations of ecosystems and natural environments, such as, you know, the tundras, the Arctic, the ocean, the deserts, you know, these great big force multipliers that sit within the natural environment. And they talk about how these are all interlinked, and how this interlinked ecosystem is fundamentally, you know, on a sort of force multiplier. So as we have climate change, each one of these things is releasing more and more carbon into the carbon cycle, which creates obviously this magnification of temperature, which changes, you know, climate for us. But the real thing they drop down into is that what has this meant? And they talk about stability, that for as long as we can remember, we've had a pretty stable set of conditions, and in that allowed us to sort of go through the agricultural age, where obviously we settled and farmed. That allowed us to sort of, you know, to settle and build houses, societies, education, cities, and then obviously moving into the industrial age and where we are, information age and knowledge age. And that's all based on stability. And what it really says is when you lose that stability, which is what, you know, you get with those biomes and the natural ecosystem, is you then get the opposite. You get instability. So you suddenly get the force multipliers of people leaving land because there is no way of surviving there, which then forces conflict with people moving into the boundaries of other countries, which causes potentially wars or trade wars, and you know, it gets to a bit of a doomsday scenario. So So it's pretty clear. It switches gears from, if you like, your natural history lesson through to your politics lesson, in pretty sort of sharp gear changes.
Sure, we get the full sort of timeline and history of it, don't we?
Yeah.
So I said we'd talk about the purpose as well, right? So what's the purpose of the film beyond just highlighting the problem then?
Yeah, and I think that's the key thing. I mean, I wouldn't say it's a sort of wake-up call. I mean, it's a fire alarm. It's a fire alarm with sort of electrodes, but the good thing is they're saying you can get out of this. Here's the exit. If you listen clearly and follow us, we can take you to a safe place. But there's no more time to sort of hesitate. So when I sort of use that analogy, the purpose of it is, as you say, not just highlighting the problem, but it is about saying now, let's move.
Exactly. So yes, the film next points us in the direction of the solution, which is, of course, in part at least, the finance sector, which we learn is facing a pinnacle moment full of opportunity to make systemic change towards a sustainable future. So obviously, the next big question then is how, and that's where it takes us. How do we make this transition to a low carbon economy? And then it goes into a bit more detail and gives us 5 business goals that we can work towards. We've got number 1, understand where businesses are vulnerable. Number 2, declare and halt your negative impact. 3, consider stakeholders and decision making, seize new opportunities. And finally 5, build a whole new system. And that's really where I want to go. Could you run us through these goals and talk us through what a new system would look like? But before we do, let's take a quick look at an extract from the film itself.
We need to recognise that investors, customers, employees, all stakeholders are changing.
This is the real generational shift, that my children actually saying, what can I actually do in order to make a difference? And they're finding that answer in what they wear, they're finding it in what they eat, they're finding it in how they travel. And I think the big new revelation is they're going to find it in where they put and where they invest their money.
There will be a time when we will look back and ask ourselves what we did right now. How do we want to be remembered?
A recent study found that 8 in 10 US individual investors and 9 in 10 millennial investors expressed an interest in sustainable investing.
Yeah, well, it's of course enormously challenging and almost as challenging to put it into a couple of minutes. But essentially, I think lots of people, of course, are going to want to defend their current position. Lots of people have a vision of a brave new world. We've only got 10 years, so we've got to leverage off of what we've got. Now, the financial ecosystem obviously is part of the problem, as has pretty much all activity of society being part of the challenge. And the reason is that we just were not managing and measuring these things that we've been speaking about. And so therefore, when you look at just one of those things that people talk about, the externalities, when you're building and pricing a product and investing in it, you are worrying about, the quality of the clean air, the quality of the water, the ecosystem that you were going into, etc. These externalities were not priced into the product. They were not part of the risk equation. So essentially, the financial ecosystem, not to blame it, but it's been part of the problem. But in terms of identifying it as the regulators and the stability boards and governments have done as being part of the solution, what they're trying to do, first of all, is to green finance. And so, many in the finance industry sort of balk at this and think they shouldn't bear the responsibility. But money makes the world go round. So these folks are going to have to look at what they do and look at pricing in the risk of these externalities in the material world and redirect capital to these projects, which are going to be positive, if you will, to the solution that we're talking about today. But all of this is quite clear to people, although, of course, some people are lagging, but it's actually about an opportunity. It's the biggest opportunity, since the beginning of the industrial age, because you can create new jobs, new economies, and so forth as you retool and embrace this and re-level out, this unequal distribution of wealth that we've seen. So it's a huge opportunity, greening finance. But then what we do is we finance green, as I've implied. You look at the projects downstream that, such as we've just heard in the UK's 10-point plan, such as, green hydrogen, etc. These are what we mean by financing green. The people that invest in those will do well from it. The people that build and work and develop those industries will do well from it. So there is a definite win-win here from all angles, and it's very much got to be done in the next 10 years. So you've got to build off of what we've already got.
And can I just say, you've done a brilliant job to capture some of those projects and success stories in sustainable finance on FinextraTV, which leads me quite nicely into the next part of our review, Richard, which is looking at the evidence, because the series this film belongs to comes from a collaboration between WWF, Netflix and Silverback Films, and brings WWF's Living Planet report to life, doesn't it? And that's really where I want to go next. So in summary, this report highlights how spatial finance, remote sensing, satellite imagery, Earth observation and machine learning together can start to provide the ability to identify nature and climate, risk and opportunity in more real-time and forward-looking financial decision making. So a bit of a mouthful there. So what are your thoughts from the report, and what evidence do you think it's presenting?
Yeah, well, I think that the industry looks at it, and quite frankly, financial services industry says, look, we haven't been measuring this stuff before, so we don't feel as though we're equipped to actually make these decisions. And it's a risk-based industry, so there are people constantly saying, don't do that because of the regulatory risk or the reputational risk or the financial risk, etc. So they've got well-grooved practices. And what they do is they look for corporate disclosure fundamentally that says, what are you doing now in these new areas? So they put the burden onto the corporates to say, are you green or not? And of course, they then go to data providers and rating agencies and say, can you double check their homework? Are they really as green as they say they are? And this leads to a whole discussion around, correlation between data sets and greenwashing and all the stuff we talk about in the interviews. The evidence, I think, that points us to where we need to go in the areas you just spoke about, satellite sensors, spatial finance, risk, AI, that lovely mouthful of words. It goes right back to our first workshop where we had Nick Wise from Ocean Mind. I'll always go back to that story, where he said, I can look at the ships sailing out of ports, and I can figure out if they're going to the places they should go with their licenses, how long they're fishing. Wow. Is there potentially, slavery on board because they've been at sea for too long all that amazing data. And everyone was going, wow, you must be a massive organization. And he was like, no, we're very small, but we use technology incredibly well to pinpoint the problem area. And then we can trace that back through the value chain so that we can say, those fish are sustainable. That wholesaler is therefore true to put a label on and saying it's green and so on and so forth. Now, we've gone a lot further since then, and we've seen great examples in the market of GHG Sat, who've released satellites into space and spotted methane plumes, which nobody knew were there. And the reason I highlight that is because your corporate disclosure would have said green. The rating agency would have said, yeah, they're green. But the space agency, if you will, GHG Sat, saw that they had the equivalent of 1 million cars emissions being pumped out. Nobody knew. So we can't trust the disclosure. We need this alternative data so that we get a better check and balance. And the great thing about satellites is they cross borders and boundaries, and nobody can kind of constrain them from the data they are actually reporting. And so that's what we look to for evidence, so much more of that sort of thing.
And all of those examples you've given leads me quite nicely into the final part of our review, which is the call to action, taking into account everything that we've covered so far and linking it with the evidence from the report and what's also being covered in past SF.Live events so far. How do you think they support each other, and what can we expect from the next event, which I believe is fast approaching?
Yeah, well, I think we're going back to a certain extent to some of those first workshop and that Ocean Mind example, because what that did was that allowed us to see where can you bring in this external data from satellites and sensors? How do you map that to physical and transitional risk, which has obviously become to the fore through the EU taxonomy? And then how do you bring that into the risk systems, which then obviously advise where the capital is allocated? All of that now has got a lot more weight behind when you listen to people like Christine Lagarde and Mark Carney, etc. They're talking about forward-looking, dynamic risk and a pricing gap. All these things that we spoke about have come to the fore. So we're going to look at, we don't underestimate how difficult it is for the industry to find this new way of operating. So we're going to bring the value chain of people from in the space industry, in the Earth systems analysis industry, in the risk modeling industry, and also, of course, in the finance industry together, so that we can identify the challenges in people, process, and technology, as well as in ways of exchanging data. And we're going to identify both the problems, try and find solutions, as well as obviously find opportunity, so that people can learn from maybe examples, scenarios, case studies that they can then implement themselves.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm really looking forward to it. And it's not a regular event, is it? Could you run us through the format, because I think that's particularly special?
Well, I'm sort of jokingly calling it sort of like Saturday Kitchen Live, because what we're doing in this new world of doing things virtually is we've got the kind of experts in the kitchen, if you will, in the workshop, at the whiteboard, and they're leading us through, the preparation of this solution or this meal. We've got experts dialing in, think of it as the people that are the wine experts, talking about the wine pairing. So we've got people from other disciplines, coming in and saying, this is what you need to think of for this to be fully operative. And then our audience can either join in, as they would there with Twitter or whatever. We're going to do it with apps and polls and Q&As, but they can contribute their view, their insight, and they can help shape the direction that we go on. Or you can just be passive and you can just sit back and watch, So that's why I think, that's it's pretty unique. And we'll produce a visual record as we have done before. We'll record it so people can really feel involved, learn from it, and take away stuff back to their organizations.
Mm-hmm. Well, really looking forward to it and bringing it back to the film Our Planet Too Big to Fail. I urge anybody who's going to be tuning into the event to give that a watch, and we'll include the link below the review, because it's a nice introduction to what we'll be covering. But Richard, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us on our first FinextraTV review. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, great stuff. Thanks again.